Hey everybody, this is Beyond Range, and we're going to continue with some GTO Wizard training. We're going to be playing single raise pots. We're just going to see what they give us, what situations arrive, and what we are going to do about it. Now, we're not going to go in so much depth this time. This time, we're just going to kind of identify the situation, probably the strategy, and then what our hand's job is. So on this texture, it's a pretty high EV board for the big blind, relatively speaking. Our opponent is going to have a lot of future nuts. They're also going to have just a lot of equity. Right, so our betting range is going to be strengthened. This particular combination is not particularly efficient to be betting very often. It's still reasonable to end up having this kind of hand bet, but again, you want to think about which side it would go on more. More checking, more betting. Is it a pure check? Is it a pure bet? And then once you have that foundation in check, then you can start to think about things like, is my opponent overfolding? Is he overcalling? How does he respond to double barrel? How does he respond to triple barrel? How does he respond to bet check bet in the bet line? Oh, when I check back, does he probe too many strong hands? Is this checking range too weak? Does he overfold to delays? How can I think about the game tree and put him in a spot? Right? So this is kind of where we are looking at this from. We're thinking about the situations. So blind versus blind, our opponent goes with the check. Now the jack is a little bit stronger for the small blind here, and the 7 and the 6 are a little bit stronger for the big blind here. In addition to that, cards like a 10, 9, 8, 5, 6, 7, 4, even a 3 are pretty decent for the big blind. So there are going to be a lot of cards that devalue the small blind's advantage. And because of that, he'll have a slightly higher check frequency. Now, when you think about a hand like King 8 here, where does it sit? And actually, what do you want to do in terms of your strategy here, right? Now, your opponent's advantage, right, would be in the aces, the kings, the queens, the decent jack X, 10s, 9s, 8s, and a lot of your hands would end up being like 7x, 6x, jack X. So, does that mean that you want to use a small sizing? Well, maybe not, because when you end up when you end up opening, it might make more sense to just start betting your strong hands and then checking your middling hands and using some of the weaker hands or hands that actually kind of have some amount of equity or ability to repolarize later against your opponent's range. This might be a reasonable strategy. Now we're going to start to take a look and think about what strategies are going on. Now here, I would generally use a big bet. I would look at this spot and I would say, okay, well, overall, we don't have this great nut advantage. Something like 60, 70, 50% makes a lot of sense. At equilibrium, apparently, we're trying to leverage both sizings. And it doesn't really matter because you can just combine them into one. Now we want to take a look at the equity graph here quickly and see how, yeah, the small blind does have a decent advantage. What we see though is that once they end up going with the check, the range actually ends up being quite a bit weaker, right? And what you also are going to see is that when they end up betting, their range is going to strengthen compared to when they arrive just to the flop, right? This range is kind of strong. Again, I'm not sure if this is turquoise or blue. I don't have the correct vocabulary. The one under it appears to be green to me. But basically, you can see that the small blind, which is turquoise, his betting range is significantly stronger once he ends up going with the bet. But there get to flop ranges like this. You want to think about it structurally. And then you can start to evaluate, well, how much is my 7x worth? How much is my 6x worth? What other types of hands would want to start betting? Right? Now let's say our opponent goes with the check. You can start to see that our betting range is about 45%. You can say, well, how often would top pair bet more than that? Oh, we're only betting about 55% with top pair. I thought it would be slightly more, so I made a misestimation. Now we're looking at something like second pair, and we can say, well, how often is second pair betting? Well, it's betting less than the overall range is betting. It's only betting about 40%. How about third pair? Oh, it's only betting 30%. You can see that you're not just choosing one or the other. You can also start to take a look at something like hand like a draw. How often would one of these draws bet? Oh, we're betting most of the time. Not all of the time. You can think about the consequences of if you always bet your flush draw on the flop and then a turn comes. Well, you don't have any flushes on the turn. Now, maybe your opponent's Jack X is worth a lot, and he can value bet big and multiple times and force you into an indifferent situation with your bluff catchers, and actually do that very often because he knows that his hands are now ahead. He knows that now his pocket tens are likely to be quite strong here when you don't have flushes, or he knows that when you bet all of your Jack X on the flop, he knows that his Queen 7 is very strong and he can bet kind of aggressively. So you see that when that's the case, it would make more sense for you to actually start having hands in your check range, because how he would respond if you were too capped, etc., etc. Right, so we're looking at these kind of things. Apparently this hand is only betting about 40% of the time. Very nice. I kind of made a misestimation. I thought that hand would be betting a little bit more often. Now ace a6, what we're seeing is that our range in this situation is extremely strong, right? And we have a very large equity advantage. In addition to that, we have a nuts advantage. We have stronger trip ace-x. We have a lot of pocket sixes. We have more trip ace-x in general. It's a really good spot. However, our opponent is actually going to be folding very aggressively. And the strategy that he will be taking is being able to try to force us to put in money with weak hands when he has an ace. He wants to be able to leverage his ace-x in this situation. Now, it's not that he has an advantage, it's just that we have a lot of other medium hands in our range after we bet, then he can pressure with this region. Right? So the strategy here is that we're going to be betting very often small, and also we might have such a large advantage in terms of nuts that we start using some slightly bigger bets as well, because he wouldn't be putting in enough money otherwise if we end up going with only small bets. Maybe that's not the case in this situation, but there's this kind of equilibrium where it goes back and forth. You're not trying to memorize the answer, you're trying to understand the logic of the situation. So what we find is that this situation we're going to be betting roughly range, maybe a little bit less, but it's such an advantageous spot for in position. And in addition to that, we want to start to think about the bet sizing. So I was actually thinking that there might be a touch of larger bet in this range, but not really. I was slightly confused. Now let's take a look at our opponent's response when we end up going with the small bet. Now I'm actually even more surprised, because I thought that the small blind would be maybe raising a little bit more aggressively with some of their hands like ace queen, ace jack. I thought they would do a little bit more folding with their hands like queen 10, queen jack. Definitely even hands like king 9 with the 9 of spades I thought would actually do a bit more folding. A very interesting situation. We could go more deep into why this is the case, and basically the future advantages for the big blind and the overall range composition that's pretty strong here, and also how basically if out of position is betting or raising too often, then his range is going to become a bit weaker, and now in position is going to put additional money and more money when his range composition is weaker for thin value bets and more bluffs, and then that's going to take more EV away from the weaker portions, and then we see, oh no, they're actually, in reality, they're just calling more. This seems to be the strategy. It makes sense, right? So if we're calling way too many ace-x, let's say we're calling more than this, then our opponent is not going to be putting in as much money on the turn or on the river with thin value bets and bluffs, right? So then it would make sense for us to raise more, and vice versa. If we raise too often and our range is too weak, then they're going to be betting more often when we check. So you find this kind of happy medium. My prediction was that we would be raising more than this is out of position. I thought the overall raising range would be something closer to 13-14%. Apparently it's really only about 10% here. So I'll go to the next one. So on the king 8-4, what we find is that in position ends up having a decent equity advantage. However, the big blind is going to be doing very good in terms of the nuts, right? Now, MP does not always have pocket fours in his RFI range, but it's absolutely fine to always RFI. What we also find is that MP does not always have king 4. MP, a lot of his flushes would be coming from the king of spades, whereas the big blind is going to have a lot of various spades that are doing quite well here. In addition to that, he's going to have an advantage on an 8, on a 4, making more trips if an 8 or a 4 comes. In addition to that, on a 7, on a 6, on a 5. What you'll see is that there are more straights and 2 pairs for the big blind than the hijack. Again, because of this, you'll see that the checking frequency is reduced. We could go deeper into let's look at the strategy. We don't need to just click, but we want to take a look at the shape of the overall strategy, because this is just a very efficient hand to check. But let's think about this. So I thought the betting range would be actually reduced. I thought it would be like 30%, maybe like 33%. Apparently, the checking range, yeah. So the checking range is actually 25%. And what we see is this very, very large advantage here for the hijack. And you also see that the big blind is calling extremely wide against the min raise. He's calling stuff like 7-5 offsuit, 9-7 offsuit, 10-8 offsuit. That's pretty wide. You can see that in terms of the advantage of equity, he's got almost 60% equity. That's really massive. That's a really, really big number. So we'll do one more hand and then we'll call this a video. This is one way to approach it. So on King 3-3, the big blind is going to have a few more 3x. He'll have more of the random suited 3x, like 6-3, 7-3 suited. Hands like 5-3 suited, 4-3 suited. However, the button will not be raising those. But the button will also have an equity advantage. Think about the shape of the ranges. In position, we'll have a lot of hands like ace-queen, pocket jacks, king-queen, ace-king, pocket sevens, pocket aces. In position, we'll have more equity. So you can again start to predict what is going to likely happen in this spot. We'll take a look at the actual strategy on the flop, and then we'll wrap this up. We'll see if our prediction was right. My prediction, I didn't announce it, but I thought that we would be betting about 50-55% of the time. And in fact, it's actually only 40. So this ability for the big blind to be able to use his advantage of 3x is kind of significant. You can see his advantage here, with this turquoise being above the green, right? With the big blind's nuts in this top region being a little bit stronger, whereas all of the medium hands, all of the weaker hands are basically behind. Very interesting spot. Now we'll take a look at the equities as well. Yeah, 53.5 makes sense. I thought it was maybe a little bit more for the button, so I'm kind of misunderstanding the strength of the big blind here. I want to take a look at what the actual big blind's weakest 3x are. I wanted to know if something like 3-2 suited would be in this range. I wanted to know if something like 10-3 would be in this range. I didn't think 10-3 would be in this range. Apparently it even gets in there. So, very nice. Anyways, guys, this is an episode. This is Beyond Range. I love you all, and I'll see you next time.